My name is Tom Harris, and this is Exploratory Journeys. My guest today is Joseph Benamy, the same as last week, and we're going to continue our discussion of China's infiltration of the Western world, and in particular, the Communist Party infiltration. So, Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's great.
Always great. It's always good to sit down and talk with you, Tom. So.
Yeah, well, that's right. We never have a lack of things to talk about.
That's true. And, for people who don't know you, Tom, you're kind of like a modern Renaissance man. Because you have so many interests and so many areas of expertise in that it's if there's never an opportunity, there's never a dull moment, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, that's good. A few years ago, I went to a Peace, Order, and Good Government meeting here in Ottawa. They're an excellent group, a conservative group, generally speaking, and they were talking about the prejudice and the enslavement of Muslims in the East Turkestan region of Pakistan.
Right.
And it was interesting because there were two people speaking, a professor of history from Carleton University, I can't remember his name, but he said that his email, his phone calls, all of his communications were constantly bugged now by the Chinese embassy. And the lady who spoke was an East Turkestan activist. And what she told us about what's going on in East Turkestan, which is, to the far west of China. Funny they call it East Turkestan. But regardless, it was in fact the enslavement and forced labor of the Muslim population. She said that over 1 million Muslims are in concentration camps. And so I asked her at one point, I said, well, what's the best thing for the average person to do about that? I mean, not like we have much control. She said, oh, yes, you got lots more control than you think. Do your absolute best to not buy made in China. And when you do so, tell the store owner, oh, I'm looking for a fan, let's say, because the other day I was buying a fan for my trailer that's not made in China. I'm prepared to pay a little extra. And they rummage around and they find one made in Denmark or wherever. And you tell them it's because of their violation of human rights, their enslavement, etc. So she said, if enough people do that, it can start to have an impact. Do you think that's naive, or will it have an impact?
I think it would have an impact if you could get enough people to do it. I'm skeptical about whether or not you can get enough people to do it. I don't think that people really care that much to become informed, A, and then B, to take it to the next step and actually take action, which is going to require some sacrifice on their part, namely either doing without the product that they're looking for or possibly paying more for it. Mm-hmm. So while I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't do that, I think that the return on the effort in creating such a movement is quite limited. Mm-hmm. I'm not a big fan of these mass movements, and my experience of mass movements, to the degree that I do have any experience, is that they can very easily be pushed off course. Mm-hmm. And so, because you can't really control the messaging that much. Mm-hmm. I actually do have a suggestion.
Okay.
And my suggestion is actually, I think, far more doable. I think we should boycott, or at least threaten to boycott, the Winter Olympics in China in 2022. Mm. And the reason for that is that rogue regimes, tyrannical regimes, such as the Communist China's government, really do care about their image internationally. Mm-hmm. And even more so when we're talking about the Chinese government, because there's a cultural thing there as well. So I would say this, particularly here, given the fact that we're in Canada, that we're Canadian, and given the controversy, the conflict between Canada and China right now with respect to
the two Michaels.
And I can't remember, Robert, I think it's Robert Schellenberger, who his death sentence was upheld by a quote-unquote appeal court very recently as well. And I consider these to be hostages.
Yeah, well, the second Michael was just sentenced to 11 years.
11 years for espionage,
camp. Yeah.
I think these are trumped-up charges. I think that the time is ripe for a country like Canada, rather than lecturing the Chinese. I would just say basically, you know what? Not only are we not coming to the Olympics next year, but we are going to spend a considerable amount of our diplomatic capital in convincing other countries to do the same thing. And I actually don't think that we would have that much difficulty. I can't say what would happen with
trade.
I can't say what would happen with the Americans, but I'm pretty certain that Australia would jump on that bandwagon. New Zealand, some of the South Pacific democracies would get on board. And as sure as you and I are sitting here, Tom, the Chinese government, because you're thinking to yourself, what do they care about? That's the hardest thing when you're talking about a government of a country that is not answerable to the people. How do you make them care? What do they care about? Well, I guarantee you that these guys care about the Olympics. They do. They want to put on a showcase for the world, and so they care. They care. The Russians cared. The Soviets cared back in 1980. They cared a great deal. And I would say that the Chinese government, because of cultural differences, would care even more. So there's something that we could do tangible that doesn't require a whole lot of mobilizing the grassroots or anything like that. This is it's a government decision. And, we were talking about this on our show recently, and we had one caller call up, and we talked about the fact that, is it fair for the athletes who want to compete for your country? And my answer was, well, yeah, that's the operative phrase right there, for your country. You could still compete in the World Championships. Oh, yeah. You could compete. All you're doing in the Olympics is you're competing on your national team for medals. All right. So if your country now comes to you and says, well, you're going to have to make this sacrifice, why wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly.
Why wouldn't you? So I think that that's a very real
I like that
thing.
idea. I think it's something we should be bringing up quite often now in preparation for 2022.
Right.
Yeah. And according to Rich Kozlovich, who we had, he's a China expert, he said the Chinese have very thin skin with respect to international reputation.
Right.
And, it's interesting, when Australia, for example, spoke out against Chinese, what was it? I guess it was probably Chinese treatment in Hong Kong. The Chinese embargoed all the coal ships from Australia. So yeah, there'd probably be some feedback. Actually, I would think that
some pushback.
Some pushback. Do
Right,
you think
right.
China would start embargoing Canada the way they threatened the Ukraine? Remember that? That just happened a few weeks ago, where the Ukraine joined in with other groups in condemning China over their treatment of, I believe it was the Uyghurs. And China immediately told them, well, then you're not getting this shipment of the anti-COVID vaccine. And it was much cheaper, apparently less good too, than the North American version. So not only did the Ukrainians drop their signature of the open letter condemning China, but they led an open letter on the other side congratulating them on their openness and, all the various things that they say they have that they don't really. You know who was also on the letter with Ukraine? North Korea, Iran, Russia, so they used their economic lever to force the Ukrainians to completely change sides on an issue that they agreed with Canada and other countries.
Well, as I said before, I think that the Chinese have a great deal of economic leverage that they could deploy. But I do think that they would think long and hard before they pulled that trigger, if you will. It's
Canada.
one thing to do it to Ukraine. It's another thing to do it not just to Canada, but to a coalition of Western countries: Canada, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, not to mention other countries in Southeast Asia that would never do something like this on their own. But if they felt that they had the diplomatic backing of the democracies in what I'll call the Anglosphere, if you will, I think that they would be far more prepared to do that, because we all know that at some point in time we are going to have to stand up to the Chinese government, the communist Chinese government.
Mm-hmm. Or they'll just simply take over the whole world.
Yeah, and this is the thing is, and what we haven't done very well, I think, in the West is we haven't really come up with a good strategy similar to the George Kennan strategy of containment that was deployed against the Soviet Union for a number of years, eventually leading to the collapse of the communist regime in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Would that happen in China? I don't know, but I do know that we deal with the Chinese communist government completely differently than we dealt with the Soviet government, on economics and on diplomacy and et cetera. So how do we contain China? And that's really what we have to figure out. And, let's not kid ourselves. I think that the idea of boycotting the Olympics is intriguing, and I think it would be very effective. Would it have a long-term effect? I don't know, because it's a one-time event.
Well, I asked Rich Kozlovich, who was our China expert guest on the other station, I asked him, is Chinese takeover of the world inevitable? And he said, definitely not. He said, there's a lot of internal problems in China. For one thing, shortly their population, I think he said 20% will be over 65.
Right.
And quite a few of them, a third or something, don't have any retirement benefits. So they're going to have a lot of people to look after. And, China apparently has a lot of dissent quietly in the background, waiting to bubble up. They have more Catholics each year than we have in the whole of Canada. So there's a lot of people who are quietly going. In fact, I was reading that the influx of Catholics from China is more than the whole number in Canada per year. Into the world at large. I'm not sure the numbers exactly, but the fact is the Chinese population, they're smart. They can see what could be. And that leads us actually to a part of China that is free, and that is Taiwan, nationalist China. Rich thinks that the Chinese, in their big operations, their amphibious exercises, which of course would be necessary to invade Taiwan, he thinks it's all show. He doesn't think they're going to do it. And one of the reasons is that the Americans have fully armed Taiwan with missiles and other, anti-aircraft and all sorts of things that, in fact, if the Chinese, who've not got experience with amphibious landings, it's not like the American Marines landing in Normandy. The Chinese don't have experience in actual fighting in amphibious landing. He says if they actually invaded that way, they would be massacred on the beaches of Taiwan. And Taiwan are very serious about defending themselves from China. I asked Rich, do the nationalist Chinese have the stomach for actually fighting the communist China? He said they fear being taken over by communist China more than fighting them. Because obviously they wouldn't last for long. And apparently, and here's an interesting factoid that'll kind of intrigue the listeners, nationalist China, Taiwan, wanted to buy a submarine because they wanted to put it in the strait between China and Taiwan to blow any landing crafts out of the water before they got to Taiwan. And China, through their influence, was able to prevent Taiwan from getting a submarine from anybody in the world. Anybody in the world. And so, consequently, these gutsy Taiwanese are making their own submarine. And it's going to be stationed shortly, I understand, between China and Taiwan. So they're a pretty gutsy bunch. I mean, if we had their courage, I think we'd solve the Chinese problem.
Yeah, it's funny that you refer to them as Chinese, because the truth is I don't. That's not to say that they aren't. It's just that I just, in my mind, I have always pictured the Taiwanese as Taiwanese, as a separate group, and for all intents and purposes, that's what they are right now as well. So I don't know enough about the dynamics to be able to say with any kind of authority whether or not people in Taiwan still consider themselves to be the legitimate Chinese, but. At Taiwan, my goodness, there is an incredible success story, not just economic but political as well. I mean, to go from essentially a dictatorship to a thriving democracy, and one of the strongest democracies in the world, I would argue. So there's a lot we could learn from the Taiwan experiment. And they've essentially done it themselves. They haven't done it under pressure from anybody else.
Yeah, because Chiang Kai-shek was